When Melania Trump arrives for what should be a routine flight, she's thrust into a web of secrecy, covert agents, and a whistleblower holding evidence that could shake the foundations of global power. The sky over Geneva was still cloaked in pre-dawn gray as Melania Trump's black sedan glided through the security gates of Andrews Field, a private executive airstrip nestled quietly at the base of the Alps. The mountains stood like silent sentinels beyond the runway, their peaks shrouded in a thin veil of fog. It was the kind of morning where breath crystallized in the air, and footsteps echoed a little louder than usual. A flight assistant opened the car door and Melania stepped out, composed as ever in a tailored navy coat that flared at the hem. A soft cashmere scarf looped elegantly around her neck. The crisp air caught her heels as they clicked against the pavement, each step sharp and deliberate, as she approached her private jet waiting on the far end of the tarmac. The aircraft gleamed beneath the muted morning light, its sleek silver fuselage reflecting the mist like a ghost. The engines were quiet, the boarding stairs lowered in anticipation. Everything about the scene should have felt routine. Melania had taken this route dozens of times before. Yet something was off, subtle, almost imperceptible. The crew moved with unnatural stiffness, their glances darting toward one another but never toward her. A maintenance worker fumbled a clipboard to the ground. A flight attendant stood awkwardly at the base of the steps, wringing her hands behind her back. Melania's instincts, honed from years under scrutiny, in rooms full of whispered agendas, flickered to life. She said nothing, but her gaze sharpened. Her security detail trailed behind at a respectful distance, per usual. They knew she valued solitude. Before travel, these final quiet moments before takeoff were a ritual, where she could breathe without expectation. But today, even the silence felt heavy. As she neared the aircraft, the pilot stepped into view. Julian Rayner, a former Swiss Air Force officer, now the seasoned captain of her flights for the past 3 years, approached with a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Normally, he greeted her with a crisp nod and an easy confidence. Today, his shoulders were tense beneath his jacket, and his hands twitched slightly as he adjusted the tablet clutched to his chest. "Good morning, Mrs. Trump," Julian said, voice composed but oddly hollow. "Morning, Julian," she replied, her tone polite but clipped. Her eyes studied his face. "Are we ready for departure?" Julian hesitated, barely perceptible, but to someone like Melania a pause said more than a paragraph. He glanced over her shoulder toward something behind her. She resisted the urge to look. "There's been a small delay," he said carefully. "I've been instructed to, well, I've been told you're not cleared to board, yet." She stopped walking. The words struck her like a sudden gust. Cold, unexpected, and wrong. "Not cleared," she repeated, her voice low, dangerous in its calm. "By whom?" Julian's mouth opened, then closed again. His Adam's apple bobbed. "I can't say, ma'am. I only received the directive this morning." Melania stared at him, her blue eyes narrowing slightly. Her posture remained statuesque, unyielding, but the temperature around her seemed to drop a degree. She took a slow step forward until they stood almost chest to chest. "This is my aircraft, my flight. I don't take kindly to cryptic refusals before sunrise, Captain." Julian swallowed. "I understand, ma'am, believe me, I do. But the order was marked classified. I was told you're to remain on the ground, for your safety." That last phrase set off every internal alarm. "For your safety" was never said unless something was terribly, undeniably wrong. She finally turned her head, just enough to glimpse the source of Julian's earlier glance. A matte black SUV sat idling 50 yards off, its windows completely blacked out. Unmarked. Government issued. It hadn't been there when she arrived. He turned back to Julian, voice like glass. "Whose definition of safety are we using today?" He didn't answer. Melania's fingers curled around the handle of her carry-on. Something was happening, something big, and whatever it was, they didn't want her on that plane. Melania didn't flinch. She stood with the calm, contained energy of someone who had been underestimated too many times and always come out stronger. Her eyes locked onto Julian's, reading him like a dossier. He had always been steady, professional, the kind of man who thrived under pressure, but now, under her gaze, he looked like a soldier at war with his orders. She took one deliberate step closer, her voice sharp and clear in the cold air. "Captain Rayner, either you tell me who gave this directive or you move aside, but make no mistake, this ends now." Julian didn't move. His hand tightened around the tablet, knuckles whitening. "Ma'am, I was given direct instructions by a government liaison, someone tied to international intelligence. They arrived at the hangar before dawn and issued sealed protocols. I can't override them." His voice dropped, almost pleading. "Please understand. I'm only trying to keep you safe." She tilted her head slightly. "By grounding me? On my own flight? With no explanation?" Her tone wasn't angry, it was surgical. She wasn't raising her voice because she didn't have to. Melania Trump knew the weight of her presence. It wasn't theatrics that unnerved men, it was precision. Julian swallowed again. "They said it was time-sensitive, a matter of national interest." "This sounds like theater," she said coldly, "not security." A rustle behind them drew her attention. Two figures had emerged from behind the SUV. One wore a long overcoat, tailored with military austerity. The other dressed more casually in a dark sweater and boots. They walked toward the jet with confident, efficient strides, like men used to closed doors and quiet authority. Julian turned as they approached, already bracing himself. "That's Elias Dorn," he said quietly, "and his associate, Varga. They said they're with the European Intelligence Commission, but something about them, it doesn't feel right." Melania's eyes followed the pair, studying their gait, their expressions. Elias, the older of the two, had the slick composure of someone used to giving orders without context. Lucas Varga, younger, exuded the restless energy of a man constantly looking over his shoulder. Neither of them made eye contact with her until they were almost within arm's reach. "Mrs. Trump," Elias said with a small diplomatic nod, "apologies for the inconvenience. I assure you this is a precautionary measure, not a personal slight." Melania didn't blink. "You're attempting to commandeer my aircraft. Forgive me if I don't appreciate the nuance." Lucas shifted nervously beside Elias, clearly surprised by her unshaken demeanor. Elias, however, didn't falter. "There's a sensitive operation underway, one we're not at liberty to fully disclose. All you need to know is that we're acting under vague threats, vague authority, vague men," Melania said, each word as cutting as the air. "Try again." Elias's jaw tightened, just enough to betray irritation. "There is a security threat involving an asset currently on board. You boarding that aircraft complicates our efforts to contain it." "Then remove the asset," she said evenly. "Or move to another jet. This one's mine." Vargas stepped forward as if to intervene, but Elias subtly blocked him. "We can't do that," he said. "And neither can you." Behind them, the engines gave a low whine. The auxiliary power had been engaged. Someone was preparing the plane for takeoff. Melania's eyes flicked toward the cockpit. "Who's flying?" Julian answered before the agents could. "Not one of my crew. I don't know who's in there." Melania took a step back, surveying the scene again with new clarity. The silence of the crew, the locked cockpit, the black SUV, the unshakable insistence that she not board. Something dangerous, possibly explosive, was unfolding, and they were using her jet as cover. She turned back to Elias. "You're running an operation without informing the jet owner, without civilian clearance, and without disclosing your cargo or personnel. That's not intelligence work, that's a hijacking." "I suggest you lower your voice," Elias said calmly, but there was steel beneath the civility. "This doesn't concern you." "It does now," she replied, unblinking, "because you made the mistake of thinking I'd walk away." Julian exhaled slowly. "Mrs. Trump," he said under his breath, "we should call someone, the Swiss authorities." "I already did," she said quietly without looking at him. "Or rather, my assistant did. Reinforcements are coming." Elias's polite facade cracked. "That was a mistake." "No," Melania replied, taking another step forward, now standing between him and the plane. "The mistake was underestimating me." The air between them buzzed with invisible wires. Tension, fear, power. Elias held her gaze for a long, weighted second. But Melania didn't blink. Not once. Not even as the storm behind those blackout SUV windows began to stir. Melania didn't need a briefing to know the situation was unraveling. The longer she stood on the tarmac, the clearer it became this wasn't just about blocking her from boarding a flight. Something deeper, more covert, was in motion. Her sharp gaze swept the perimeter and locked onto the jet. The auxiliary power unit still hummed, a quiet, mechanical pulse that shouldn't have been active unless someone inside the cockpit was prepping systems for departure. Yet no one from her flight crew had gone on board. That detail alone made her pulse quicken. Then she saw it, two more figures, distant but visible through the thinning fog, standing near the nose of the aircraft. They weren't part of her team. She would have remembered faces like that. One was speaking with rapid, almost agitated gestures, the other listening but tense, arms crossed. The way they moved, assertive, efficient, discreet, screamed intelligence fieldwork, not civilians, not commercial crew. She leaned slightly toward Julian. "Who are they?" she asked under her breath. "I don't know," he murmured. "They were already here when I arrived, brought in by Dorn and Varga, said they were clearing cargo." "Cargo?" she repeated, eyes narrowing. Her attention flicked again to the dark SUV parked near the hangar. It hadn't moved since her arrival, but now a third vehicle rolled up behind it. Same style, same diplomatic plates. Reinforcements. Whoever orchestrated this was ramping up the pressure. She reached into her coat and pulled out her phone, fingers moving quickly. Her assistant picked up on the first ring. "They've grounded me," Melania said. "Find out who authorized this. Cross-reference EIC activity in Geneva. I want names." Her voice was low, deliberate, and calm, but inside every nerve was alert. She wasn't just being delayed. She was being removed from a chain of knowledge she was never meant to touch. She hung up and looked back at the jet. Something inside that aircraft was important enough to risk a breach of protocol. Important enough to trigger this much shadow theater. Then, something new. Movement inside the cockpit. A silhouette barely visible, shifting behind the glass. Whoever it was hadn't identified themselves. And they were ignoring protocol, refusing contact and initiating systems unprompted. That wasn't just irregular, it was a breach of international aviation control. "Julian," she said, her voice tighter now. "Get up there." He hesitated. "Ma'am, if they're inside with authorization..." "Authorization doesn't lock out the pilot," she snapped, "unless they're hiding something." Julian nodded reluctantly and started toward the stairs. As he moved, Varga stepped out of nowhere, intercepting him. "The cockpit's sealed," he said. "We're running internal diagnostics. Please step back." Julian stiffened. "I'm the captain of this flight. If the cockpit's sealed, someone's violating airspace code." Varga didn't budge. His eyes flicked toward the jet, then to Melania, then back to Julian. "Best not to escalate." Melania stepped beside them. "You're too late," she said coolly. "It's already escalated." Varga held her gaze for half a second, then looked away. Somewhere in the fog, a jet engine groaned to life. Melania's eyes snapped back to the aircraft. The scene had changed. Her property was being weaponized in real time, and someone inside was trying to take off with something they didn't want the world to see. Julian took the steps two at a time, the sound of his shoes ringing out sharply against the jet's metal staircase. Each stride was powered by a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. He'd flown this aircraft for years, knew its sounds, its smells, its quirks like the back of his hand, and everything about this morning felt wrong. When he reached the cockpit door, it was sealed from the inside, locked. That wasn't just protocol breaking, it was dangerous. He knocked sharply, his fist hitting the reinforced door with authority. "This is Captain Julian Rayner. Open up, now!" No response. Only the soft hum of the systems coming to life behind the metal barrier. He waited a beat, then knocked again, louder. Still nothing. He reached for the emergency override panel and entered his code. The light blinked red. Denied. Julian's brow furrowed. Someone had already reprogrammed access. Possibly from the inside. That narrowed the list of suspects to a dangerous few. He stepped back and reached for his comm. "We've got a problem," he radioed to the crew below. "Cockpit's locked. Override's been blocked." Melania, still standing at the base of the stairs, snapped her head toward him. "By whom?" "I don't know, but someone's inside." With no time to lose, Julian flipped open the emergency toolkit hidden in the service panel and keyed in a manual bypass code. This one hadn't been changed. The cockpit door clicked. He gripped the handle and swung it open, stepping inside with every muscle braced for confrontation. What he found wasn't what he expected. The man sitting in the co-pilot seat wasn't one of his crew. He was young, mid-30s maybe, with pale skin and a thin frame that suggested stress had taken its toll. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes sunken, and his hands trembled as he clutched a tablet displaying an encrypted messaging interface. Behind him, strapped to the floor where emergency gear should have been, sat a crate, large, unmarked, and secured with reinforced metal locks. The only marking on its surface was a faded seal Julian recognized immediately, the emblem of a multinational security council known for black site operations. The man's head jerked up as Julian entered, eyes wide with panic. Don't come any closer," he stammered, his voice cracked and dry. "Who are you?" Julian demanded, closing the door behind him. "What the hell are you doing on my plane?" The man glanced at the crate, then back to Julian. "I didn't have a choice," he whispered. "They said I'd be safe if I got on board. They said I'd disappear, that it was the only way." Julian stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're not crew. You're not listed. That crate isn't manifest. What are they transporting?" The man's grip on the tablet tightened. "It's not just cargo. It's evidence. Documents. Audio files, recordings, all of it. Proof of what they've done. The corruption. The collusion. It implicates people you don't question. Heads of state, CEOs, generals. The people who don't just break the rules, they write them." Julian's stomach turned. He looked from the man to the crate. "And you?" "I leaked it," the man admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought I could get it to the right hands, but they found me. They're using this plane to get me and the files out of reach, off the grid, somewhere no one will find either of us again." Julian's pulse thundered in his ears. It wasn't a delay, it was an erasure, a purge, a clean sweep under the guise of procedure. "You're the payload," Julian said quietly. "You and that crate." The man nodded miserably. "And once we're in the air, I don't think I'm supposed to make it to the landing." Julian took a slow breath, then turned and bolted from the cockpit. He bounded down the stairs, face pale, heart racing. Melania stepped forward the second he landed. "What's on that plane?" she asked sharply. He didn't hesitate. "Evidence. A whistleblower. Someone trying to expose something massive. They're using your jet to move it all. Out of sight, out of reach." Melania's expression didn't change, but her eyes darkened. She looked toward the plane, then toward the agents across the tarmac. "Then we're not letting it leave the ground." Melania stood motionless for a moment, the weight of Julian's words settling like lead in her chest. Evidence. A whistleblower. A secret shipment disguised as a routine flight. She turned slowly toward the aircraft, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Tell me everything you saw," she said, voice low. Julian recounted the scene in the cockpit, how the stranger clutched a tablet like it was a lifeline, how the crate was bolted down and unlabeled, except for one thing, the seal of the Multinational Security Oversight Council, a group known only to those who operated in corridors most people never knew existed. Melania's eyes narrowed. "The MSOC seal?" she repeated. "That crate could hold anything. Surveillance archives, covert interrogation records, or worse." Julian nodded grimly. "The man said it's all digital. Audio, video, documents. Files that connect key players across governments and corporations. Corruption on a global scale. Money laundering, arms deals, political blackmail." He didn't say it outright, but It sounded like the kind of material that could bring down entire governments if it ever went public. Melania's gaze flicked back to Elias Dorn and Lucas Varga, who now stood farther from the plane, locked in a tense conversation near the second black SUV that had arrived minutes ago. "They're not intelligence officers," she said. "They're fixers. Damage control. They're not here to assess a threat, they're here to erase it." Her mind was already moving several steps ahead. She'd spent years navigating political theater and watching power manipulate public perception. But this was different. This was raw, desperate, an operation hastily thrown together under the cover of pre-dawn fog. "They're moving the crate and the man together," she continued, thinking out loud, "because the files are encrypted. He's the key to unlocking them. That's why he's alive." "For now," Julian added. The implication landed hard. Melania looked back at the jet, now aware that it had become a prison and a weapon. "We need to ground it, now. If that plane takes off, both the truth and the man who can prove it vanish." Julian's jaw tensed. "I can disable the fuel line, quietly. It'll look like a mechanical issue at first." "Do it," she said immediately. "We'll hold them at bay long enough for help to arrive." As Julian moved toward the fueling station at the edge of the tarmac, Melania pulled out her phone and called her assistant again. "I need a secure channel to a journalist I trust. Push the signal through a ghost server, and get me the Swiss Federal Police. Tell them an unregistered extraction is in progress under foreign jurisdiction, and tell them to bring everything: aviation inspectors, forensic techs, media liaisons. It's time this stops being a secret." She ended the call and began walking slowly, deliberately, toward the agents, her heels clicking against the cold pavement like a metronome counting down to impact. Elias Dorn looked up and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Trump," he said with mock civility, "you're still here. You're using my aircraft to transport stolen intelligence and a man you intend to silence," she replied evenly. "I'm not going anywhere." Lucas Varga took a step forward, face flushed. "You don't understand the gravity of what you're interfering with." "No," Melania countered. "You don't understand the gravity of who I am." She stepped closer, eyes locked on Elias. "You thought you could play cloak and dagger with someone who's spent decades inside rooms far more dangerous than this. You should have picked another flight." Elias' expression twisted, momentarily revealing the irritation bubbling beneath the polished surface. "You're making a mistake." "No," she said coldly. "I'm making a decision." Behind them, the quiet hiss of the fuel pump cut out. Julian stepped back from the jet, wiping grease from his hands, and gave Melania a subtle nod. The plane was going nowhere. The air around the jet shifted, the hum of tension now audible in the stillness, as Melania stood her ground with the full force of a woman who refused to be maneuvered. The agents had underestimated her. They thought she'd be rattled, that she'd retreat behind polite diplomacy or yield to vague threats. But Melania Trump had endured media storms, international scrutiny, and political warfare. This wasn't new to her, only more direct. She stood between the aircraft and the agents, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable but firm. Elias Dorn approached, his jaw clenched, the thin veneer of civility slipping from his voice. "Mrs. Trump, you need to leave the perimeter. This is now a secured operation under federal jurisdiction. Your presence here is a liability." "Whose jurisdiction?" she countered, "because last I checked this is Swiss airspace. And you've offered no credentials, no transparency, and no chain of command." Her voice was steady, crisp, measured in a way that disarmed more than it provoked. "You're using my aircraft without consent, transporting a man who's asked for protection and concealing a cargo crate sealed with a Black Ops agency's insignia. That doesn't sound like jurisdiction to me. That sounds like a cover-up." Lucas Varga moved forward quickly, his posture tense. "You're interfering with an international security protocol." Melania didn't blink. "If it's so secure, why didn't anyone inform the flight's owner? Why the locked cockpit? Why hide your manifest?" She took a step closer, closing the space between them. "You may be used to making people disappear, but this isn't some backroom operation in a failed state. This is Geneva. You picked the wrong airport and you picked the wrong woman." Elias's restraint finally cracked. His voice dropped, low and sharp. You don't know what you're getting involved in." "Then enlighten me," she replied. "Tell me what's in the crate. Tell me who the man is. Tell me what you're so afraid the world might see." Behind her, Julian stood at her shoulder now, hands still smudged with grease from disabling the fuel line, his presence quiet but resolute. "The aircraft's grounded," he said, almost too calmly. "Whatever mission you were running just ran out of runway." Elias's face darkened. He turned to Lucas, who nodded subtly and began speaking into a discreet radio clipped inside his jacket. Melania caught it, a signal, a fallback plan, a shift in strategy. She could feel the current changing. Whatever came next wouldn't be bureaucratic. And then came the voice, deeper, colder, from behind them. "That'll be enough." They turned to see a third agent stepping out of the second SUV. He was taller, broader, older, gray hair cropped short, eyes hidden behind mirrored glasses. His suit was pressed with brutal precision, and everything about his presence screamed command. "Special Agent Calder," he said flatly, offering no badge, no ID, only a warning wrapped in civility. "You've made quite the scene, Mrs. Trump." "Not yet," she replied, "but I can." Calder took one slow step forward. "You've interfered with a highly sensitive operation. What you're doing here, blocking federal transport, delaying classified material, it has consequences." "So does trafficking a whistleblower without protocol," Melania said. "So does hijacking an aircraft. So does hiding the truth." He paused, taking her in with a calculating gaze. "This isn't personal." "It never is," she said quietly, "until the wrong person disappears." The words hung in the air like a flare, and for the first time Calder didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the jet, toward the agents, then back to Melania. The power dynamic had shifted. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't run. She had simply stood and refused to move, and that made her the most dangerous person on the tarmac. Julian moved swiftly, his breath fogging in the icy morning air as he crossed back toward the fuel truck parked just beyond the safety lights. The mist clung to his jacket, wrapping the edges of the tarmac in a ghostly veil, but he moved like a man on a mission, precise, invisible. The agents were still locked in verbal chess with Melania, who held their attention like a spotlight. Her voice, though calm, carried a sharp edge that sliced through their rehearsed lines and false authority. Every second she kept them talking was a second Julian needed. Time was no longer a luxury, it was a weapon, and this was their only move. He ducked behind the fueling line, crouching low beside the jet's intake valve. His fingers moved quickly, tugging open the narrow maintenance panel that hid the heart of the refueling system. Inside, a tangle of tubing, digital control locks, and hydraulic regulators blinked in standby. To the untrained eye, it was a confusing mess. But Julian had worked on aircraft since his 20s, combat models, commercial liners, and these sleek private jets built for discretion and speed. He knew exactly where to strike without triggering alerts. He pulled a wrench from the emergency kit strapped beneath the truck, glancing once over his shoulder to ensure no one was watching. His hands moved with steady efficiency as he loosened the flow regulator on the left side intake line, not enough to cause suspicion, but enough to trigger an engine imbalance warning the second the pilot tried to fire up. The diagnostics would fail. The plane would be grounded. No one would know why until it was far too late to fix. As he bolted the panel shut and tucked the wrench back into its slot, he felt his heart pounding, not from exertion, but from the weight of what they were doing. If they were wrong, if the crate wasn't what Noah claimed, if this was all a misunderstanding, he would be ruined. But he had looked into the whistleblower's eyes, and he had seen fear, not for himself, but for the truth. Back on the tarmac, Melania stood as unmoved as the mountains in the distance. Her arms were crossed, her chin slightly raised, her gaze locked on Agent Calder with the precision of a sniper. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. Calder's voice was still even, but his posture betrayed him. He was unraveling. He hadn't expected resistance, not here, not from her, and certainly not this composed. She wasn't panicking. She was waiting. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was giving Julian cover. Calder's eyes narrowed, lips parting as he prepared to deliver his next warning. Another carefully phrased threat dressed in protocol. But Julian was already back by her side. He didn't waste time. "Done," he whispered. "They won't get off the ground." Calder's head snapped toward him. "What did you do?" he demanded, voice harder now. "Prevented a crime," Julian replied without hesitation. "Sabotaging federal property is a felony." "Not when it's her property," Julian snapped, jerking his thumb toward Melania. "You commandeered it under false pretenses." The agents reacted instantly. Elias barked into his comms, his voice clipped and urgent. Lucas Varga's hand drifted toward the inside of his coat, where Melania was certain a weapon waited. The tension surged, thick and electric. One wrong word, one flinch, and everything could ignite. And then? Sirens. Faint at first. Then louder. A chorus of them. Blue and red lights pierced the morning fog as police cruisers, airport security vehicles, and military-grade transports rolled onto the tarmac in unison. Their tires hissed against the wet pavement. Doors flew open. Uniformed officers fanned out with urgency and command. Calder muttered a curse under his breath. Melania didn't move. Her voice was cool and final. "You said there would be consequences," she said. "I'm counting on it." And in that moment, the entire power dynamic flipped. The jet was grounded, the covert op was exposed, the agents were no longer in control. Melania had turned their trap inside out and set the truth free. The first Swiss police vehicle skidded to a halt just beyond the restricted zone, its blue lights casting sharp flashes across the fog-drenched tarmac. Moments later, more units arrived. Some marked, others unmarked. Their doors opening in unison as a coordinated wave of uniformed officers and plainclothes investigators stepped out. Their presence shifted the atmosphere entirely. Until now, the agents had operated in a theater of shadows, relying on silence, intimidation, and procedural vagueness. But the sudden arrival of local law enforcement transformed the scene from a covert extraction into a public incident. Calder, Elias, and Varga instinctively regrouped, their confident posture faltering as they whispered rapidly into their earpieces. They hadn't planned for this. Not here, not with Melania refusing to be moved, and now, with international eyes about to be trained on their every move. A senior officer stepped forward, a woman with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that swept the tarmac like searchlights. She paused before the agents, then turned to Melania. "Mrs. Trump," she said in crisp English with a Swiss accent, "we received your alert. You claimed there is an unauthorized extraction in progress using a private aircraft." Melania nodded. "That's correct. There's a detainee on board held against protocol. There's also a crate of digital evidence the agents refuse to disclose. I want the aircraft secured, now." The officer turned sharply to her team. "Secure the perimeter. Lock down the jet. Nobody boards, nobody leaves." The agents protested immediately, Calder stepping forward, waving a badge that glinted in the light. "This is a federal operation under international authority. We are not required to brief civilian law enforcement." "You are on Swiss soil," the officer interrupted coolly, "and in my jurisdiction, that means you answer to me." It was over. For the first time, Melania saw something close to fear in Calder's eyes. Not panic, not rage, just the dawning awareness that their operation was no longer in the dark. It was in the open, under scrutiny, and slipping further out of their control with every passing second. The cockpit door eased open under the watchful eyes of the Swiss authorities, and for the first time that morning Noah Albrecht, the whistleblower, stepped out into the cold light of day. He looked fragile in the glow of the flashing police lights, his face drawn, clothes wrinkled, and wrists still marked from the restraints he'd been forced to wear. But there was something else behind his exhaustion, a flicker of hope, faint but unmistakable. As the officers guided him carefully down the stairs, he clutched the tablet to his chest like a shield. When he reached the tarmac, his eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Melania. "You stopped the plane," he said hoarsely, disbelief laced in his voice. "I didn't think anyone would." Melania stepped closer, her voice calm and resolute. "You have something the world needs to see. I couldn't let them silence you." Noah hesitated, glancing toward Calder and the other agents, now corralled by Swiss police and forced to stand down. "It's all in here," he whispered, holding up the tablet. "The files, the recordings. They show how deep it goes: bribes, cover-ups, surveillance programs on foreign citizens, even assassinations dressed up as accidents. And they were going to disappear me, just like they did to the others." Julian, now beside Melania, asked quietly, "Can it be verified?" Noah nodded. "There are backups, geo-locked. If I don't make a secure handoff, they'll self-destruct. But if I do, it all goes public." Melania met his gaze, steady as stone. "Then let's make sure the right people get it." For the first time, Noah's shoulders dropped slightly, as if a weight had lifted. He wasn't alone anymore. The plan to vanish him, to erase the truth, had failed. And now, under the protection of Swiss authorities, and with Melania Trump standing in his corner, the story he risked everything to tell was finally about to be heard. By the time the sun fully crested the horizon over Geneva, the once isolated tarmac of Andrews Field had become a hive of chaos and flashing lights. News vans lined the perimeter fence, cameras raised high above shoulders, reporters shouting into microphones while drones buzzed overhead to capture aerial footage of the now grounded jet. The story had spread like wildfire. Private jet hijacked in Swiss airspace. Melania Trump stops covert extraction. Whistleblower uncovered with explosive files. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Photographers crowded the edge of the security cordon, snapping images of Melania Trump standing at the center of it all, poised, composed, immovable. The symbol of control she had been forced to project for years now became something else entirely: defiance, leadership, truth in motion. A reporter, bold enough to push past two security officers, called out, "Mrs. Trump, is it true you stopped a rogue government operation?" Others joined in, voices rising with urgency, each question more pointed than the last. Melania didn't flinch. She stepped forward, raised a single hand, and the crowd fell into a hush. "What happened here today," she said, voice steady, clear, and cutting through the noise, "is a reminder of what happens when secrecy is used as a shield for corruption. But more importantly, it's proof that no matter how powerful the lies, the truth still finds a way to surface." The cameras rolled, microphones leaned in. The agents, once the hunters, now stood back, stripped of control, as their operation crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Noah, shielded by a ring of Swiss police, was ushered into a secure vehicle. The evidence, too, was being transferred piece by piece into the custody of independent investigators. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a reckoning, and Melania had ensured it couldn't be buried. As the tarmac slowly cleared and the sirens faded into the distance, a heavy silence settled over Andrews Field. The storm had passed, but its aftershocks remained. Melania stood beside Julian near the hangar, watching as Swiss authorities methodically catalogued the contents of the jet and escorted the last remaining agents into separate vehicles for questioning. Noah had been taken into protective custody, his tablet secured in a sealed evidence case, guarded as if it held the fate of nations. Because in many ways, it did. For the first time in hours, Melania allowed herself a breath. Not of relief exactly, but of realization. The weight of what had almost been lost, and what had just been saved, hung in the air like fog refusing to lift. Julian broke the silence beside her. "You didn't have to get involved," he said quietly, "but you did." Melania didn't look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the now silent jet, the plane that had almost become a flying graveyard for truth. "Walking away was never an option," she replied. In that moment it became clear, this was more than just a morning gone awry, it was a line crossed. She hadn't just stopped a cover-up, she had exposed a fault line in a system built on secrets. There would be backlash, retaliation, attempts to twist the narrative, but none of that mattered now. The evidence was in the right hands, the story had begun to spread, and she had stood in the middle of it, not as a bystander but as a catalyst. And once truth is spoken into the world, it cannot be silenced. The morning sun now bathed the tarmac in pale gold, casting long shadows across the empty runway as the last of the media crews began to pack up. But Melania Trump remained. She stood alone for a moment, her coat tugged gently by the breeze, eyes fixed on the jet that had become a symbol of everything they had fought to stop. It no longer looked sleek and invincible. It looked vulnerable, exposed, just like the system it had been commandeered to protect. Julian approached, his tone softer now. "It's not over, you know. This is just the first crack." She nodded, not looking at him. "Good. Cracks let the light in." Behind them, officers loaded the sealed crate into a secure vehicle bound for Geneva's federal tribunal. A police escort followed close behind, a new chapter already in motion. Noah, now under watch by international observers, had begun detailing names, dates, recordings, a network so wide-reaching it would take weeks just to comprehend its scope. Melania turned toward the edge of the tarmac where journalists waited behind a barricade. One of them shouted her name, but she didn't answer. Not yet. There would be time to speak again, once the truth had room to breathe. She glanced at Julian. "They'll regroup, come at us differently." "Then we stay ahead," he replied. A small smile touched her lips. "No, we stay loud." As they walked away from the grounded jet, its engines silenced and secrets revealed, one truth echoed louder than the rest. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much bigger war, and Melania Trump had just made herself impossible to ignore. The story of Melania Trump and the flight that was never meant to leave delivers a powerful lesson about the cost and necessity of standing up for truth in a world built to suppress it. At its core, the narrative reminds us that silence can be just as dangerous as action, especially when powerful forces operate in the shadows. Melania, though not a government official, refuses to be a bystander. Her courage to question vague authority, challenge intimidation, and act when others hesitate shows that real leadership isn't about titles, it's about responsibility. The story also teaches us that truth is fragile, easily buried under protocol and power plays unless someone is willing to risk their reputation, safety, or future to protect it. By grounding the jet and shielding the whistleblower, Melania proves that even the most elaborate cover-up can be undone by a single act of defiance, and perhaps most importantly, the story reveals that exposing the truth is only the first battle. The real war begins in keeping it alive and seen. In a world flooded with noise, this story reminds us that doing the right thing may not always be easy or safe, but it is always necessary.